There is a story unfolding right now that almost nobody is connecting the way it should be connected. Welcome to Updated Intel. The President of the United States flew to Beijing this week with the chief executive of Boeing sitting in his delegation, and from a state dinner inside the Great Hall of the People. Donald Trump went on Fox News and told Sean Hannity that Xi Jinping had just agreed to order 200 Boeing jets. 200. Boeing wanted 150. The president said they got 200. Now think about how that sentence is supposed to land. It is supposed to land as a triumph, as proof that the trip worked, as evidence that the world's two largest economies are talking again, that American manufacturing is back, that the man in the room knows how to close, and in the framing of the visit, that is exactly how it was sold. But within minutes of the announcement, Boeing's own stock fell almost 4%. Within an hour, Wall Street analysts who had been tracking this deal for months were on television explaining why a 200-jet order, what would be the largest single Chinese commitment to Boeing in nearly a decade, was being treated by the markets as a disappointment. And about 3,000 kilometers to the north, in a quiet town called Mirabel, just outside Montreal, the Canadian Prime Minister was watching the same news. Mark Carney has reason to watch it carefully because 8 days earlier, on a single afternoon in that same Quebec town, Carney had quietly signed the largest order for a Canadian-built commercial aircraft in the entire history of this country. Most coverage is treating these two stories as if they belong on different pages of the newspaper. They do not. Over the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what happened, why it happened in this order, and why the contrast between what Donald Trump brought back from Beijing and what Mark Carney already had in his pocket may be the most revealing economic story of the year so far. Here is what actually happened in Beijing. On the second day of his state visit to China, President Trump sat down for a televised interview with Fox News host Sean Hannity. He had spent the day in meetings with President Xi Jinping. He had attended a state banquet at the Great Hall of the People, and during the interview, he said this: Xi had agreed that very day to order 200 Boeing aircraft. He used the phrase 200 big ones, and he emphasized the jobs. He repeated twice that Boeing had asked for 150 and that he had pushed the number to 200. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, had been signaling for days that a large Boeing order was coming. The Boeing chief executive, Kelly Ortberg, had personally flown with the president as part of a delegation of senior American business leaders. That delegation included the chief executive of Apple, the chief executive of BlackRock, the chief executive of Tesla, and the head of Goldman Sachs. This was, by any measure, the most concentrated assembly of American corporate power to visit Beijing in years. If you want to keep up with deep economic breakdowns like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an update from us. And the headline they wanted to bring home was Boeing. That is the official framing. The operational timeline tells a different story. For nearly a decade, Boeing has been effectively locked out of the Chinese market. The freeze began with the global grounding of the 737 MAX after two fatal crashes, and it deepened as trade tensions between Washington and Beijing escalated through three different presidential terms. Between 2018 and the start of this year, Boeing has delivered just over 100 aircraft to Chinese customers in total, about the same number of MAX jets that Chinese airlines accepted in a single year in 2018 alone. During that drought, Boeing's main competitor, the European manufacturer Airbus, moved in. Airbus did not just take some of China's business, Airbus took almost all of it. In 2019, China's national aviation regulator placed a single order for 300 Airbus aircraft. Multiple large orders followed. By this year, Airbus had built a position in the Chinese market that aerospace analysts describe as dominant. China is on track to become the world's largest aircraft market within the next 20 years. Its commercial fleet is expected to roughly double to nearly 10,000 aircraft. Boeing being shut out of that market is not a quarterly problem. It is an existential problem. So when reports began circulating earlier this year that Boeing and Beijing were negotiating a major package, the numbers being discussed were enormous. Bloomberg News reported in March that the deal could involve up to 500 narrow-body 737 MAX jets. Reuters reported similar figures, sourced from industry insiders. The investment bank Jefferies modeled a potential order of 5 to 600 aircraft with another roughly 100 wide-body jets, the larger, longer-range planes on top of that. By the time the president's plane touched down in Beijing, the prediction markets were assigning an 82% probability to a major Boeing announcement. The expectation, in other words, was not whether, it was how big 200 jets is a real number. 200 jets is, by the standard of the last 8 years, a significant return to a market Boeing badly needs. But 200 jets is also less than half of what the market was modeling. And in the announcement Trump made on Fox News, the president did not specify which aircraft were included. He did not name the airlines that would take delivery. He did not say whether the agreement was a firm contract, a preliminary framework, or a political commitment that still needs to be turned into signed paperwork. He said 200 big ones. He said it was a lot of jobs. The market priced what the market saw. Boeing shares fell by roughly 4% in afternoon trading, their largest single-day decline in months. One U.S. senator publicly warned that China has, in his words, never lived up to one contract it has ever signed. The shares regained some ground later in the session, but the message from professional investors was clear. The number was the headline. The details were missing, and the details are where deals like this either become real or quietly disappear. That is the first piece of the story. Now, hold all of that against what happened in Quebec 8 days earlier, because the timing matters more than almost anyone has noticed. On the 6th of May, Mark Carney walked into a hangar at the Airbus Canada facility in Mirabel, just north of Montreal. He stood next to the Premier of Quebec, Christine Frechette. He stood next to the chief executive of the commercial aircraft division at Airbus, Lars Wagner. And he stood next to Tony Fernandes, the co-founder of one of the largest low-cost airline groups in Asia, the Malaysian carrier AirAsia. And in that hangar, they signed an order for 150 Canadian-made A220 jets with options for another 150. The list price value of the firm portion of that order is approximately $19 billion US minus $19 billion in aircraft, every single one of them to be assembled in Mirabel, Quebec. It is the largest single firm order ever placed for the A220 program in its entire history. It is, in the words of the Prime Minister's office itself, the largest order for a Canadian-designed and Canadian-produced commercial aircraft ever signed anywhere in any decade. And it pushed the A220 program past 1,000 total orders for the first time. Now, consider what that means in practice. The A220 traces its origins back to Bombardier, the Quebec aerospace company that designed the aircraft, originally called the C-Series, before nearly going bankrupt and selling the program to Airbus in 2018. The province of Quebec had invested $1 billion US into the program to keep Bombardier solvent. For years, the question hanging over Mirabel was whether the line could even survive. Airbus was producing only 7 or 8 A220s a month. The break-even rate was 14 a month. Local economic development authorities in the region had spent years quietly worrying about layoffs. This order changes that calculation completely. The AirAsia agreement gives the Mirabel facility a backlog deep enough to anchor production into the 2030s. It locks in work for more than 4,600 assembly staff, more than 4,600 Canadian aerospace workers whose jobs are now secure. For years, it supports more than 850 Canadian suppliers, from machine shops in the Laurentides region north of Montreal to engineering firms in the city itself. It transforms Mirabel from a struggling program into one of the largest commercial aircraft success stories Canada has ever produced. And the Prime Minister himself addressed the AirAsia chief executive directly at the ceremony. He thanked Tony Fernandes for, in his words, the trust being placed in Canadian workers in Quebec and in Mirabel. He said Fernandes was choosing the best at exactly the right time. It was not a speech designed to make American headlines. It was a speech designed to make Canadian payrolls stable for the better part of a decade, and it happened with almost no American attention. There is one more layer here that you need to understand. AirAsia is a Malaysian airline. Malaysia, like much of Southeast Asia, sits inside the wider Chinese economic orbit. The A220 program in Mirabel is co-owned by a European manufacturer, Airbus, and by the province of Quebec, which holds a 25% stake. So production lines for U.S. customers are run separately at a facility in Mobile, Alabama. The Mirabel line, the one that just received this $19 billion order, builds aircraft for the rest of the world, including increasingly customers across Asia. In January of this year, Mark Carney became the first Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade to visit Beijing. He met with President Xi, he met with the Premier Li Qiang, he met with the chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, Zhao Leiji. He signed a new strategic partnership covering trade, energy, and aerospace. In that same agreement, China explicitly committed to looking forward to Canadian investment in aerospace and advanced manufacturing. He came home with a preliminary deal on canola tariffs. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola seed were scheduled to drop from a combined rate of roughly 85% down to approximately 15%. That single change unlocks roughly $3 billion in Canadian export orders. And in the same package, Carney set a national target to increase Canadian exports to China by 50% by the year 2030. That visit happened 4 months before Donald Trump flew to Beijing this week with the Boeing chief executive and his delegation. And 4 months before Carney was there first, he met the same leaders. He signed papers in the same great hall, and he was there with a strategy that did not depend on a single press conference to define whether it had succeeded. And here is where the two stories intersect in a way that should concern anyone watching. The global trade map being redrawn in real time. The standard framing of this week's news is that Donald Trump went to China and brought home a Boeing order. The standard framing of last week's news, to the extent it was reported in the United States at all, was that Airbus signed a deal with a Malaysian airline, and those framings miss what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that two North American leaders are pursuing two completely different strategies for engaging with the Asian aviation market, and the early scoreboard is not what the headline suggests. The American strategy is loud, transactional, and dependent on a single leader's ability to deliver a number on stage. The Canadian strategy is quiet, structural, and tied to factories that already exist on Canadian soil, building aircraft that Canadian workers already know how to make. One strategy delivered a 200 aircraft commitment whose details remain unspecified. The other strategy delivered a 150 aircraft firm order with options for 150 more signed, and AI announced inside a working assembly line with the Prime Minister of Canada in the room. Consider the numbers side by side. 200 Boeing aircraft, type unspecified, value undisclosed, contract status unclear. Announcement made through a television interview. 150 A220 aircraft, model specified, value approximately $19 billion. Contract firm options for another 150. Signing ceremony held inside the Mirabel facility. Formal press release issued by the Prime Minister of Canada, by Airbus, by AirAsia, and by the province of Quebec. The math does not resolve cleanly into the story the United States wanted to tell. This week, if you appreciate these deep dives into the changing dynamics of global trade, take a second to hit subscribe so you can join our growing community here. And the deeper point is this. When Boeing is shut out of China for nearly a decade, the global aviation industry adjusted. Airlines that needed narrow-body aircraft for Asian routes did not stop ordering. They ordered Airbus, they ordered the A320 family, they ordered the A220, they built fleets that depend on European and Canadian production lines, and those production lines did not sit idle waiting for American policy to stabilize. They expanded, they took the work, they built the relationships, and the Mirabel order is one piece of that larger reality. There is a particular irony in the Mirabel story that deserves to be named. The aircraft now being assembled there, the A220 was originally a Canadian design. It was developed by Bombardier as the C-Series. Bombardier nearly went bankrupt building it. The province of Quebec poured 1 billion US into the program to save it. And then in 2018, Bombardier handed the entire program over to Airbus essentially for free. At the time, that transfer was treated in Canadian financial pages as a defeat. A Canadian company forced to give away its best technology to a European competitor. 8 years later, that same program, now under European management on a Canadian assembly line, has just received the largest order in its history. The aircraft Canada once almost lost has become the aircraft Canada is now selling to the world. That story is not over. With the AirAsia order in hand, Airbus is now seriously considering whether to launch a stretched version of the A220, an aircraft that would compete even more directly with Boeing's 737 MAX, the same aircraft Trump is now trying to sell to China. What the Trump administration is now trying to do is reverse a decade of lost ground in a single week of negotiations. The 200 jet announcement, if it is firmed up and delivered, will help. Boeing badly needs it. American aerospace workers badly need it. But it does not undo what happened during the years Boeing was absent. It does not unwind Airbus's dominance in Chinese deliveries, and it does not change the fact that on the other side of the same continent, Canada has spent the last 12 months quietly building a parallel strategy that is now starting to pay off. There's one more contrast worth naming. The Canadian approach to China under Mark Carney has been described by his own government as pragmatic, interests-based, and aimed at strategic autonomy. Canada continues to maintain tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada continues to coordinate closely with allies in the Indo-Pacific on maritime security. Carney is scheduled to travel to India, Australia, and possibly Japan in the coming months. The Canadian engagement with Beijing is not a romance. It is a recalculation, and it is being conducted in coordination with Canada's broader middle power network, not in isolation from it. The American approach this week was different. It was bilateral, it was transactional, it was personal. The president flew to Beijing, sat across from President Xi, and announced a number on Fox News. There is nothing wrong with bilateral engagement. There is nothing wrong with announcing wins. But the structure matters, and the structure of what Carney has built is quite different. A strategic partnership announced months in advance, a series of trade deals layered on top of it. A major aircraft order signed inside a Canadian factory is harder to undo than a number delivered through a television camera. What comes next is the question neither government is yet answering publicly. Boeing still has to convert Trump's announcement into a firm contract. Chinese state airlines still have to decide which aircraft models they will actually take on which delivery schedule. And the deal could be confirmed in the coming weeks. It could be quietly revived. It could, in the worst case for Washington, follow the path of the January 2020 commitment when Beijing pledged to purchase $77 billion in US goods, including aircraft, and then never followed through after the pandemic hit. The history of large Chinese commitments to Boeing is a history of headlines that did not always survive contact with the next political cycle. Meanwhile, in Mirabel, the first AirAsia A220 is scheduled for delivery in the first quarter of 2028. The assembly line is running. The supply chain is moving. The Quebec government is already revising its growth projections. That order is not waiting for a press release. It is already at work. You remember the world we used to live in, the world where America led, Canada followed, and the major announcements about the global aviation industry came out of Washington or Chicago, not out of Ottawa or Montreal. That world is changing. It is not changing because Canada is louder. It is changing because Canada is quieter, and the work it has been doing quietly is starting to produce results that the loud version of American statecraft cannot match. 200 Boeing jets, terms to be announced. 150, a 220S, terms already signed. The contrast tells you almost everything you need to know about how the next decade of North American economic strategy is going to be fought and where the winds are most likely to land. If this story is telling you something you have not heard elsewhere, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear it. Like the video if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next one. This concludes our main analytical report for today, but the broader implications for international manufacturing corridors deserve a bit more focus when we examine the long-term trends of aerospace logistics. It becomes evident that the reliance on single-source assembly plants is giving way to regional networks. This shift benefits nations that possess stable, regulatory environments and highly specialized workforces. The recent contract signed in Quebec demonstrates that global buyers value consistency over political showmanship, a preference that could redefine supply lines for decades. Over the coming quarters, regional tracking data will show whether the commitments made in East Asia materialize into structural growth or remain mere items on a diplomatic ledger. For businesses operating within these supply networks, the challenge will be to navigate the differing tariff frameworks while maintaining production speed. As the competition intensifies, the true winners will be determined not by the scale of the initial announcement, but by the efficiency of the manufacturing lines and the resilience of their secondary suppliers. When tracking the development of international trade policies, we must also consider the role of secondary industries that sustain large manufacturing sectors. The aerospace ecosystem does not exist in a vacuum. It relies heavily on metallurgical advancements, specialized software engineering, and intricate global supply chains that are highly sensitive to geopolitical shifts. While the public focus remains on major passenger jets, the underlying infrastructure involves thousands of small-scale component producers whose operational viability depends on multi-year backlogs. A sudden shift in procurement strategies by major international carriers can send ripples through these smaller networks, forcing layoffs or prompting rapid shifts toward alternative markets. Thus, a firm contract, like the one secured for the Quebec facility, provides a baseline of economic stability that extends far beyond the final assembly floor, reinforcing the entire regional supply web. On the other hand, non-binding agreements or political proclamations leave these secondary suppliers in a state of prolonged uncertainty, making long-term capital investments risky. This difference highlights why the specific legal framework of a trade deal often matters more to long-term economic health than the initial monetary value attached to the public announcement. As these two distinct approaches to global trade continue to play out across North America, the true impact will be measured in the stability of industrial employment and the sustained growth of technological expertise over the next decade. If you want to stay ahead of these global economic shifts and understand the hidden forces shaping our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Beyond the immediate economic metrics, the divergent strategies employed by Washington and Ottawa reflect deeper philosophical differences in statecraft and economic diplomacy. The transactional model favors rapid, high visibility victories that can be leveraged for immediate political capital, aligning with a broader trend of highly personalized international relations. While this method can occasionally break long-standing deadlocks, its reliance on individual negotiations often bypasses established institutional channels, creating vulnerabilities when leadership changes or political priorities shift. Conversely, the institutional approach focuses on building durable frameworks, aligning corporate interests with regional government policy to create a self-sustaining economic ecosystem. This method requires a significant investment of time and diplomatic energy, often yielding results that are less flashy but considerably more resilient to external shocks. As global markets become increasingly fragmented and unpredictable, the durability of these trade relationships will face rigorous testing under changing geopolitical conditions. Observers of international political economy will undoubtedly watch these developments closely to determine which model offers a more sustainable path for middle and superpowers alike in an era defined by strategic competition and safting alliances. Furthermore, the role of state-backed financing and regional subsidies remains a contentious point of discussion in global trade forums. The historical intervention of the Quebec government in the aerospace sector underscores the complex relationship between public capital and private industry success. While such interventions are often criticized by international competitors as market distortions, they can also serve as critical lifelines that preserve essential technological capabilities during industry downturns. The eventual acquisition and stabilization of the program by a larger regional entity demonstrate how localized public investments can ultimately yield significant dividends on the international stage. This dynamic challenges the conventional narrative of purely market-driven industrial growth, suggesting that strategic state involvement remains a powerful tool in shaping global manufacturing hierarchies. As we look toward the future of the global transportation sector, the integration of advanced sustainable technologies will likely become the next major battleground for market dominance. Countries and corporations that have secured long-term manufacturing stability will be better positioned to invest the necessary resources into research and development for next-generation propulsion systems and lightweight composite materials. In this context, a stable production backlog is not merely a financial safety net, it is a critical foundation for technological innovation. The facility that is insulated from short-term market volatility can afford to focus on efficiency optimizations and environmental compliance standards that will dictate market access in the decades to come. Meanwhile, organizations caught in a cycle of unpredictable political negotiations may find themselves constrained by short-term survival strategies, leaving them vulnerable to disruption by more forward-looking competitors. The ongoing rivalry within the aviation sector thus serves as a microcosm for the broader industrial transformations occurring across various high-tech sectors globally. Ultimately, the evolution of these economic strategies reveals that the traditional boundaries of national markets are becoming increasingly blurred by transnational corporate alliances and regional manufacturing agreements. The success of a piece of technology often depends less on its nation of origin and more on the strength of the international network that supports its production and distribution. As lines of commerce continue to reconfigure, the ability to cultivate diverse cross-border partnerships while maintaining strong domestic production capabilities will be the defining characteristic of successful economic leadership. The events of recent weeks are not isolated incidents, but rather indicators of a broader trend toward a more multipolar economic reality where influence is distributed across multiple manufacturing hubs and strategic networks. The changing landscape of industrial manufacturing also highlights the critical importance of workforce development and the retention of specialized technical expertise within national borders. A manufacturing facility is only as capable as the engineers, technicians, and assembly workers who operate it. And these skills cannot be replicated overnight through political decree or sudden capital injections. Long-term production agreements allow for sustained investments in local training programs, apprenticeships, and educational partnerships, ensuring a steady pipeline of talent for the future. When production lines are unstable or subject to frequent political interruptions, the risk of losing this human capital to competing industries or international markets increases significantly. Therefore, the quiet, structural approach to securing multi-year backlogs plays a vital role in preserving the foundational knowledge base that drives broader technological progress across the economy. As the global race for economic resilience intensifies, the retention of skilled labor will increasingly be recognized as a cornerstone of national security and economic sovereignty. In conclusion, the contrasting events in Beijing and Mirabel offer a profound lesson in the mechanics of modern economic influence and the true nature of sustainable growth. While headlines will always be dominated by dramatic announcements and high-stakes summits, the long-term trajectory of global trade is quietly shaped on factory floors and through legally binding frameworks. As the next decade unfolds, the success of North American economic strategy will be judged not by the volume of the announcements made under television lights, but by the steady, unceasing output of its industrial sectors. The shift toward a more nuanced, structural approach to international commerce may lack the immediate excitement of transactional diplomacy, but its results are written in stable employment, technological leadership, and enduring global partnerships. Thank you for analyzing this economic shift with updated intel today. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep breakdowns of the forces moving our world. And we will see you next time.